I'm Rachel Bovard.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we have a fun setup, I think, for everybody today. We're going to get right into it with discussing kind of the fallout from the Chauvin conviction. We're going to get into a segment I'm going to talk about, which is why everything is woke. Emily is going to talk about Hollywood, but without the magic. And then Ben is going to talk about the COVID hate crime bill. So with that, I think we'll kick it off to start with Josh.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So we're recording this the week after the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin. Jury in that much ballyhooed case took a shockingly short amount of time to reach its verdict, something like 10 hours of deliberations or something like that. He was guilty on all three charges, including both murder and manslaughter charges. My own quick lawyerly analysis of the situation. Minnesota actually defines its murder and manslaughter codes in a very unusual way, actually. They use language that is kind of different from the model penal code, from kind of like the standard criminal codes. But I think what we would customarily call manslaughter, the prosecution had a strong case of. I was definitely a little more skeptical of outright murder. In any event, as the listeners and the viewers no doubt know, of course, this goes back to the somewhat infamous death of George Floyd late May. Gosh, it's almost been a year now. And the subsequent Antifa, Black Lives Matter, riotous anarchy that took the nation by storm last summer from really coast to coast. So there's a lot to unpack here, obviously. Obviously, we saw what Maxine Waters was talking about as far as basically saying that it is appropriate to, quote, get more confrontational in case the verdict in this case came out the wrong way. President Joe Biden, he claims he made these comments after the jury was sequestered. But regardless, at some point before the verdict was rendered, he came in there and said he was praying for the correct outcome. He was in contact with the family of George Floyd, if I'm not mistaken. It more generally seemed that there was a national culture, a somewhat kind of mob-like culture, trying to exert exogenous influence upon the jury to reach the quote-unquote correct outcome. And I think it's worth emphasizing here. I'm sure we'll get into this when we discuss it. I consider myself as pro law and order, as pro police as they come. I've done any number of kind of federal society debates on a lot of these various issues. Even I do not think that Derek Chauvin's conduct was good. This was not a split-second use of force decision. This was over 8 minutes of clearly criminally negligent excessive force. So I really do earnestly think the prosecution had a strong case on at least the manslaughter charge here. But the national culture of kind of what Lincoln referred to in his Lyceum address in 1838, the mobocratic spirit, the spirit of kind of the mob trying to render mob-like justice, was just deeply irksome. So much so that Judge Cahill, the Minnesota judge in the case, even conceded. He said that Chauvin's defense team might be able to get a mistrial on appeal because of this way over-the-top interference from other political and even kind of civilian actors. Interference, by the way, that I don't think I've ever seen in my entire history, short history, but history nonetheless, of kind of following this sort of thing. Now, the column that I wrote last week, in a sane and a just world, this verdict would have been a huge feather in the cap of Black Lives Matter. It would have been a huge feather in the cap of the progressive left, of lefties all across the country. They got the verdict that they wanted. And it seemed like, based on the time the jury took to deliberate, it was a very straightforward verdict. This should have been a clear shot across the bow message that America's criminal justice system is not, quote, systemically racist, that Black people, when they're rendered unfairly by law enforcement, will have a fair trial, and that there's every possibility, if not probability in the world, that the justice system will render the correct outcome. But literally the day after Chauvin's guilty verdict, of course, the national narrative immediately shifted to another deathly police encounter in Columbus, Ohio, with Ma'Khia Bryant. And she's 16 years old. And what we clearly see in the video of this particular instance is her with a large knife cussing off the top of her lungs. My former colleague and friend, Matt Walsh, tweeted out a video that went viral, showing her in all of her cussing glory with this knife. She's about to lunge into another teenager before she is lethally shot. And the ACLU of Ohio comes out and calls this quote unquote murder. LeBron James tweets out, all caps, demand accountability or something along those lines, with a photo of the cop before ultimately deleting the tweet. And it just seems to me that there is kind of a permanent outrage mentality here, that people are kind of, they're ginning themselves up into faux outrage. They cannot take the wins. And it seems increasingly obvious to me that these people will never be satisfied. They will never be satisfied until the entire system is just burned down and they can build something up from the debris, from the rubble. Because if you take them at their word, if you actually think that America is systemically racist, which obviously is a disgraceful, noxious lie, as David Azrad and so many others have written, there was no plausible claim that America has been systemically racist since at least the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. This ship has sailed for almost 50 years now. But if you, or excuse me, over 50 years exactly. But if you truly do believe that America is systemically racist, you will not be satisfied until the country is effectively just totally knocked down and rebuilt. Other things to discuss here, when I'll kick it over to the panel. Obviously, there's kind of a culture of just like of anarchy, of anti-cop hatred. This does not end well. Law enforcement is not the enemy here. And I think it is truly incumbent upon we as conservatives to stand up and support law enforcement. That does not demand supporting every single instance of police misconduct, of course. As I just said, Chauvin clearly did not act well in this particular instance here. But at the same time, I'll close with a quote. I wrote an essay for City Journal last month. I'm just going to read a quick paragraph from that. The title of this essay is, quote, "Recover the Moral Imperative of Law and Order." Once upon a time, these efforts to recover law and order would hardly have been needed. Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum Address, delivered 23 years before Fort Sumter, famously warned of the dangers of a, quote, mobocratic spirit taking hold among the citizenry. Almost a century later, President Calvin Coolidge observed, quote, "We are always confronted with the inescapable conclusion that unless we observe the law, we cannot be free. That a secure rule of law and a concomitant quashing of nascent anarchy is a necessary precondition for justice, human flourishing, and the common good ought to be, and not too long ago was, as ubiquitous a belief as any in our politics." So it seems to me that so many people are just with this permanent toxic outrage mentality, the Ibram X. Kendi anti-racism nonsense, the critical race theory. We have just forgotten that law and order and the rule of law is just a bare bones necessity for a just society. So on that somewhat pessimistic note, happy to kick it over if anyone has more kind of concrete thoughts on the Chauvin verdict or kind of more broader thoughts on all these kind of sweeping societal trends.
I'll start on a narrow point and then broaden it out. And on the narrow point, just first of all, there's an incredible disconnect here, and this happens constantly because the left very intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, tries to rewrite language by expanding definitions of phrases like systemic. And that, in this case, is important. We have a different definition of systemic. The literal definition of systemic, as Josh mentioned, if you look at what David Azrad has documented, for instance, there is no system in this country that treats people differently under the law for racial reasons. The left, on the other hand, insists that until we all have unpacked our knapsack of white privilege, which is an actual famous essay from Maggie McIntosh, of course, which I'm sure we've all encountered, until we have fully eradicated that, which is impossible, by the way, because it's set up such that it's impossible. Until that is accomplished, America is systemically racist when you broaden the definition of systemic to do that. Now, there are some groups who use inflated numbers, and you've seen this for years in the feminist movement. There are women's groups who use inflated statistics about, for instance, the wage gap, and they do that to fundraise. And because the media is full of 22-year-old J school graduates who write up press releases from leftist groups because they don't realize that it's not reporting, they don't realize that that's ideology, they don't realize what those groups are doing, we now have this belief in the country that for women the glass is half empty, not half full. We do the same thing, it's repeated, the pattern is repeated on racial issues. And part of that is motivated by funding groups, by BLM, that needs to fundraise off these inflated statistics, that needs to be more hysterical about certain situations to survive and make more money. It's a great way to make more money, is to go to your donors and say, people are being slaughtered in the streets and it's a systemic program, or it's a systemic problem, we need more money. But on the other hand, I think to some extent, they believe the Kool-Aid is like, you'd have to stomach pump the Kool-Aid out of people at this point, because it's indistinguishable from their worldview as the ideology. They don't realize that their worldview is an ideology. And to just be really brief, it gets us to this very sad moment where there are a lot of people in this country, particularly in the Black community, Hispanic people, women, who have been told that the glass is half empty, when in the scope of human history, the glass is half full. Are we a perfect country? Absolutely not. But nowhere have so many different people lived in such harmony in the history of the world. We have done an experiment successfully, to remarkable success, and a very difficult experiment. We have done something that no society on the face of this earth right now or ever before has ever done on this scope. And it is amazing, and we should be really proud of it. Of course, the left would say that it's easy for white people to say that, but if you look really at facts and if you look at history, it's true. And I hope that people can be more open to hearing. I hope that people can be more open to hearing from different perspectives and, addressing any problems that still need to be addressed. Absolutely. And I'm happy to do it, and I'm sure all of us are. But the glass is half full, and we should, as conservatives, develop the language and the ability to talk about that in a way that resonates.
I think I just have a more sort of on the ground focus for what this is actually going to mean, for police in practice, because, I didn't watch every day of the Chauvin trial. I was actually surprised. I was pretty convinced, kind of along the lines of what Josh said, that, what had happened was well outside the norm of what normal training would require. Right? Like I wouldn't have been surprised if it was a manslaughter charge. I was actually surprised that he was convicted all the way down. But like I said, I didn't watch every day of the trial. But I think for police more generally, because of the sentiment, Josh, that you're referencing, which is this very much like anti-police, police are racist. They have no foundational part in our society in maintaining the law and order that we all sort of require. You have people like Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago saying, well, before you engage in like a foot chase or pursuit of a suspect, you have to get sign off. Like, how is that actually going to work? And you see, people out on the street now, again, the Ma'Khia Bryant story, like they're responding to actual, problems, right? They saved this girl from being stabbed potentially fatally by someone else, and they're getting ridiculed for that. How does that actually work in practice going forward? How many people are going to want to sign up for this job to be the most hated segment of society? I think that there is a lot of, room to sort of critique how we train our police officers. Sure, let's have that debate. But I think we've turned it in on such a personal level that, that's going to have really lingering downstream consequences, I think, not only for law and order generally, but for people who even want to do this job, because I don't know how many people would at this point.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that narrow and then go broad. On the narrower point about what this means with respect to policing, look, over the last year, we've seen, I believe, the greatest percentage rise in either violent crime or murder in American history. And that's albeit from incredibly low levels and a long-term trend downward in violent crime, which was in no small part due to policing policies that BLM and the progressive movement more broadly hit. Whether there's correlation or causation associated with those policies, we can debate. But what's not debatable is the fact that violent crime has crashed down in this country over decades, and it appears that that is all coming unwound now. So for the anti-racists who claim that you judge a policy as racist or anti-racist based upon the outcomes for the people impacted by it, if their anti-capitalist, anti-cop, anti-law and order policies are followed through, those policies will be proven to be racist because they will disproportionately negatively impact the very communities they claim to care about. So that's the narrower horrible point. On the broader horrible point that Josh made, which I think is an essential one, if you think America is systemically racist, irredeemable, evil, deplorable, then it becomes a moral imperative to tear it down. And the entire kind of meta narrative around the George Floyd Chauvin issue is that it was exploiting a death in order to propagate this much broader narrative. And the day after, I believe it was the day after the sentencing was handed down, or rather he was convicted, Chauvin was convicted, Ibram X. Kendi filmed a video, I believe, for CBS News where he said something to the effect of, Derek Chauvin was convicted, but has America been convicted yet? And I think that tells you all you need to know about the fact that ultimately this movement is not about justice. it's about vengeance, and there is a woke mob mentality in this country which undermines justice, undermines liberty, and ultimately will erode the blessings of liberty and justice that people of all races and colors, as Emily spoke to, have enjoyed, and it'll be disastrous for them. But those who are sowing discord and dividing think that they'll be able to profit as a consequence of it, and that cynicism should be called out at every turn.
Yeah. So, go on. Sorry.
No, I was just going to bring the segment to a close. So, any final thoughts you have, Josh?
Nope. Was just going to kick it over to you. So, all good.
So, I think, on the note of everyone sort of, or the national dialogue sort of turning against police, it sort of begs this larger question I think a lot of us have been struggling with, which is, why are all of the institutions culturally turning leftward? Right? We talk about woke corporate power. We talk about leftism, in the government, activist Department of Justice, using the leverage of government to punish your political opponents. And last week, Richard Hanania, who I believe is affiliated with Columbia University, put out on his Substack, a now, I think, large consumption piece. It's made its way around the movement, trying to answer this question. And he did so, I think, in a really interesting way, using sort of data points about how engaged the left and the right both are. And so he basically explains why is everything liberal? His answer basically comes down to what he calls ordinal utility versus cardinal utility. And those are academic terms to basically mean this. Ordinal utility is sort of how you rank your preferences. And based on that, the country is about evenly divided, right, between Democrats and Republicans. But where it breaks down is over the cardinal utility point, which is essentially a measure of how bad you want something to happen and what you're willing to do to see that outcome be manifested in real life. The left is far more engaged on that point than the right. And he illustrates this in a number of data points. One that really struck me in particular, he looks at how willing the left is to protest, to sign petitions, to organize versus the right. And this one data point, in 2016, he points out that fewer than 1% of conservatives had been to a protest in the last year, compared to 15% of extreme liberals, 10% of regular liberals, and 5% of slightly liberal. And that was before 26, the Trump years even really took off, which, he came out with a follow-up piece today, actually on Wednesday, which discussed even more data points, showing how, this disparity has always existed between the right and the left, meaning the left has always been, far more willing, I think, to engage politically and with activism than the right, but that really amped up after Donald Trump's election. That Donald Trump, as we all know, we laughingly say broke the brains of the left, but what it really did is sort of catapult them into activism at a level that we've never seen before. And so this raises some interesting questions, I think, for the conservative movement. And some people have been trying to answer them in one sense. Robbie Suave, who is a libertarian writer at Reason Magazine, immediately came out with a short piece responding to Hanania saying, see, this is why, conservatives can't ever use the government or any institutions of power to prove their point, because Hanania points out every institution will be captured by the left. So if we give government more power or, in any possible way to use levers of power, it will be used against us because we have no hope of actually capturing these institutions. Now, that's one way to look at it. I think that's a fairly reductive point, because I think the broader point here is that, as conservatives, we actually we want neutrality, I think, a little bit in our institutions. And are there steps we need to be taking to make sure that is the case, with laws, with all these things. But I think the second part about the way Suave approaches it is it's not just the government, right? That's the whole point of woke capital. It's that in many cases, one political ideology is outsourcing what would be unconstitutional actions if the government did it. They're outsourcing it to private proxies. And that's what we're seeing. And he points out, and Hanania points out that it's this journalist, academic, activist regime that actually controls all this power. They've engaged at the intermediate level, not just sort of the top level. They're now engaging at the intermediate level, very activist forces, that really make it difficult to ignore anything. That old adage, you will be made to care. That's essentially the moment that we're living in, right? Where every choice has now become political. And Hanania says that happened to the left, particularly after Donald Trump's election. Everything was political. No choice was made in a vacuum anymore. Everything was a statement about your political preferences and thus had to be rewarded or punished as a result. But I think this raises questions for conservatives, because conservatives have always said politics is part of our life. It doesn't define our life. And we've taken pride in that. We focus on other things. We focus on, our church, our community, our family, and politics is a segment of that, but not defined by it. But the left has almost pushed things to a point where we either have two choices. We pull a Rod Dreher and Benedict option out of the whole place, right? And exist in our walled garden and never leave. Or do we have to turn into the left almost, right? Do we have to engage and make everything political and force our preferences on, the corporations or the businesses that we frequent? Or is there another way? Is there another way to, as we often talk about, engage the political process and the lawmaking process to protect, what it is to be able to make free choices in America without being punished? So those are three questions, I guess, or three options I would push to the group to see how you all respond kind of to what Hanani is laying out. Don't all speak at once.
No, I'm happy to hop in there. There's just a lot to kind of mull over and unpack here. So look, the left has always been far better than the right at organizing. Okay, this obviously goes back to kind of Saul Alinsky and Barack Obama's kind of origins and community organizing in Chicago. To me, I view that as just directly downstream of kind of the prerogative, flag bearer term, that progressives, the people on the left, place on politics in general. Politics is obviously just like a bigger part of their lives for all the reasons that conservatives have talked about for decades, if not centuries. For some kind of more secular liberals, politics is your life, right? This is kind of the famous line. What was it? I think it was Elizabeth Warren at the 2012 Democratic National Convention, where she famously said, "Government is the only thing to which we all belong." I think that was Elizabeth Warren line. So none of this is particularly earth-shatteringly new. Obviously, the Trump phenomenon did accelerate this to a tremendous extent. Look, a lot of these things we talk about in these podcasts on a seemingly weekly basis. Conservatives, the time to just sit back and rest on our laurels and just say, like, this is fine, other people will take care of it, the kind of Andrew Breitbart politics, downstream culture. I think that ship really has sailed. And we've kind of on episode after episode now, we encourage our listeners, viewers, to just get involved at a very activist level, whether it means a local level, whether it means kind of just running for school board, just local things, to try and get involved and kind of make a difference about the pushing back against the excesses of the woke ideology, everything from critical race theory to identity politics and all of its various manifestations. And I think we should just kind of continue to emphasize those points here. The big thing that conservatives are still grappling with, and I definitely think this is maybe a key distinction between so-called national conservatism and our perhaps more kind of libertarian-leaning friends, is our means ends distinctions here. And this is a theme that we talk about on the show all the time. I have this one Twitter follower who likes a bunch of my content, and his Twitter handle is Burkean ends through leftish means. That's not necessarily my stance. I'm not going to go ahead and just endorse that. I do think that there is such thing as means ends distinctions. The ends always justifies the means is not my stance per se. But, and our friend Ryan Williams, the president of the Claremont Institute, kind of more or less said this actually in a Substack post a few weeks ago, or maybe it was last month at this point. He did say that on the margin, conservatives should try to become more comfortable with a greater array, a greater extent of means to secure our ends. The late stage of the republic at this point, everything that seems to be happening around us, really, I think, does demand a kind of more prudential, less zealous, less ideologically wedded approach to the means ends distinctions.
Well, I think there's I agree with everything that's been said, and I think there's just a really easy way to understand why everything is left. And when I was thinking about this last summer, because that's when I think it sort of everybody's consciousness was raised as to the issue. Suddenly it became on everybody's mind, and everybody realized how bad the situation had gotten. The way I think about it is the progressive or bigot binary that migrated from academia to every institution. When we started sending kids to through higher education at a higher rate, the education system, was just sort of self-perpetuating this calcified version of a radical progressive ideology that stems from things exactly like critical race theory, that stems from things like you can go to Judith Butler, you can go to Fanon, you can go to Foucault, you can go down the line of people who are very popular in academia and who are taught in academia. The bottom line is that as we sent more and more people through academia and academia got harder and harder left, the graduates marched into the workforce, and that workforce is every institution. It is newsrooms, it is boardrooms, and it is writers' rooms. These are our cultural arbiters, and they have set the standards for what language you can use. They have set the standards in Washington for laws. I mean, the Equality Act, which has not passed the Senate, of course, is a great example of that. It would be signed by the current president of the United States. And it would, like these are just great examples of things where that progressive or bigot binary, which is that if you are, this is Ibram X. Kendi, he was on CBS last week, as Ben pointed out. CNN has interviewed him recently. He believes and explicitly says that you are a racist or you are an anti-racist. And in order to be an anti-racist, you have to follow leftist dogma to the letter. Any dissent then qualifies you as racist. You are not anti-racist if you dissent on one point. This is how you end up with Barry Weiss leaving the New York Times. It's how you end up with Andrew Sullivan. Barry Weiss is somebody who's center-left. Andrew Sullivan is someone who's center-right, but also center-left on a lot of these cultural issues. That's how this happens. If you dissent on one point, if you do not follow it to the letter, that's you violated the binary. And when you have that binary, it's what intimidates the boomer executives because they don't want to be on the wrong side of it, to being cowed by the millennials. And when you have that combination of educated millennials in the workforce at a higher rate and boomers who are sort of intimidated out of saying anything or disagreeing, that's exactly how you get everything turning left. It just basically comes down to the fact that we filtered more and more people through our system of higher education, and they're now leading our institutions. So it's, in my opinion, it's a really simple process to understand. If you want to go deep, you can look into people like Foucault and Fanon and Judith Butler and see exactly how they incorporate this binary into their thinking, and explicitly in cases like Kendi's. But it's a pretty simple process to understand, and I think it explains basically exactly why everything is left.
Yeah, so let me just briefly respond to Josh's point about means and ends, and essentially what are the practical consequences of this, which is in the absence of a counter force to the progressive onslaught across all of our institutions, we lose and we're wiped off the playing field. So I think it speaks for itself that there needs to be a coherent, comprehensive, really thoughtful and diligent plan worked out among those who don't want to live under progressive tyranny about how we're going to use every lever available to ultimately counter this force that really is insinuating itself in every aspect of our life in a total fashion, which is why I use the word totalitarian and mean it here. On the broader point about why is everything left now, beyond the fact that there has been no counter response from the right, as Josh noted, because we don't organize like the left does, there's something deeper, and it's maybe somewhat of an academic question, but also an interesting thought exercise to work through, which is, if you believe that ideas ultimately determine the direction of a society and a country, why is it that leftists predominate in all the idea spaces that influence our culture, influence our political system, and beyond? And, Josh makes the point, I think it's accurate, that for the left, essentially, their secular religion is leftism. And because leftism demands that it be weaved into every aspect of our life, it demands of its adherents that they push it in every single aspect of our lives. And leftists, of course, would say, well, yeah, we control the intellectual institutions and we're the activists because we're the intellectuals, and the right isn't intellectuals. And I think there's always kind of, or not just not intellectuals, but anti-intellectuals, of course, is the trope that's leveled at conservatives and libertarians and others as well. There's a question of, do these institutions attract, what is it, a psychological thing, sort of character traits or psychological traits that attract leftists to the intellectual fields? Are leftists inherently more intellectual? I think we'd have a lot of interesting responses if we were to go down that rabbit hole. One thing I would say is that people who, at least on paper, are intelligent oftentimes conflate that intelligence with the belief that they know best for others. And that fits in perfectly with the leftist worldview, which is that, for the betterment of others, to the true believers, they believe that their ideas ought to predominate and ought to dominate, and that thus they ought to be propagated down into all of our institutions. So we could go down an interesting rabbit hole, I think, if we were to pursue are people on the right more practical and work with their hands, and people on the left more intellectual? And Victor Davis Hanson would probably have some interesting thoughts on this. But getting to that question of why all our cultural institutions are dominated by people who loathe us and how we compete in those institutions, I think is a fundamental, critical question that we have to grapple with going forward, because in my view, at least, ideas really do determine the direction of society. So we better be competing in that space.
So the last thing I'll say before I kick it over to Emily is that Hanania in his original piece also makes the point, supported by the data, that conservatives compared to the left do tend to be happier and suffer less mental illness. So for whatever that's worth.
That is a great point. And actually, this is a really smooth transition into what we want to talk about next, which is a little bit more pop cultural than we usually touch on. But I'm glad that we're discussing it, because it is the Oscars have long been a cultural touchstone in the United States. There's a chart that Axios put out this week, amazing to watch how ratings for these award shows, but particularly the Academy Awards, have tumbled from near 50 million to now coming in under 10 million. There are a lot of factors at play here. I've written a piece about this, that it comes down to, I think, in large part, the nichification of our entertainment landscape. There's more choice. There aren't 4 channels anymore. So of course, viewership is going to drop. But that's not the only part of this. The nichification is also an important point about how we are increasingly lacking in shared values. We are increasingly lacking in the same language. The more that we don't all watch, 20 years ago, the film that took home Best Picture, Nomadland is probably one of the least viewed Best Picture wins in history. It certainly is in decades, lowest grossing. But Gladiator is what won 20 years ago. And Hollywood doesn't make movies like that anymore, partially because there's this risk aversion in Hollywood that we also see in other industries. Marco Rubio put out a report 2 years ago about sort of the risk aversion that exists in corporate investment in this country, that rich people are essentially just coasting off safe investments because they can. And so there's a risk aversion that is hurting the entrepreneurial spirit of the country. And you see that really in Hollywood as well. Nobody wants to take a risk on something like Gladiator when you can take your money and put it into an IP that is familiar, and you can sort of predict people are going to go see a new Marvel movie. You can predict people are going to go see a new Frozen movie. But coming up with an original concept and putting a lot of money into it, not just a mid-budget movie, but putting a lot of money into something like Titanic or Gladiator in a way that's going to capture the imagination of the entire country and appeal to the entire country. And by the way, not be made to appeal more to Chinese audiences than American audiences, which is something Hollywood suffers from a lot, and that I've written a lot about, and was also controversial at the Oscars when China blacked out news that Chloe Zhao had won Best Director for Nomadland. There's an entire discussion we could have about what that means, because Nomadland is a depiction of the ailing white working class in the United States, and some people in Beijing think that's great, and some people in Beijing think that because Chloe Zhao gave a somewhat anti-Chinese quote to an obscure filmmaker magazine a couple of 10 years ago, that she must be blacked out. But that's another conversation. Set that aside. The point is that the declining Oscars rating is amazing and well worth pausing to consider what this is doing to our culture, because we have a situation now where it's not just that people aren't watching the Oscars, that's downstream of the fact that people aren't watching the same movies. They're not watching the same television. Johnny Carson, Stephen Colbert has a very divisive act. He is a resistance boomer comedian. It is cringeworthy. It's not great, but he's cornered the niche on resistance boomer humor, and he's done it strategically, and he's the #1 host in late night, because late night hosts don't need to put up Johnny Carson's numbers anymore, because there aren't 3 networks that make up everybody's choices. So with that, I'm going to open it up to the group, but the question really is, as our economy I reported a couple of weeks ago, I remember that the Daily Wire was eyeing the men's grooming business after Harry's ditched them from advertising, and they were serious about it. They might literally launch a men's grooming service for people that aren't conservative but are just anti-woke, that don't want their grooming service being woke. As our economy splinters and our entertainment economy and media splinters, we are going to share fewer cultural touchstones. We are going to share less of the same language, and the Oscars illustrates this well. So with that, I'm just going to open it up to the group. What does this mean? What is the danger here?
So this is something I've been thinking a little bit about, less through the lens of culture, but I think it's very linked to the economy, because I work on a lot of big tech issues, run up against this argument of you should just build your own. You should just build your own. And this is sort of increasingly what we're seeing, even Daily Wire, getting into the, men's grooming business, or, Black Rifle Coffee, being the conservative sort of coffee vendor, or, whatever. More and more, I think conservatives are starting to actually build not just their own companies here and there, but like their own infrastructure. Right? Mm-hmm. Every element of society, how we engage not only the culture, but how we engage the economy, we are creating almost two completely different countries housed within the same geographic location. And this is becoming, more and more prevalent. I think, frequently of Rightforge, who is this, internet hosting company, right? But they want to build a whole uncancelable stack. So what happened to Parler can never happen to another business, right? So, but it's not just the web hosting, it's the email, it's all these different services. And again, that is infrastructure. We are actually beginning to build not only our own companies, but our own infrastructure to support those companies. So it's like, how long before you see a bank, that's exclusively tailored to, meet conservatives, who don't want Bank of America sharing their data with the government because they went to the wrong protest, right? Which we're already seeing. So on one hand, it is sort of the manifestation of the market, I suppose. But on the other, I think it further divides us. It further, Emily used the term sort of the niche market. We are literally building two countries. I don't know how else to describe it. And I don't know how you sustain a self-government that's supposed to be built on some kind of consensus, whether it's culture or political or principle. We don't have that. And this build your own movement, I think, is a real reflection of the disintegration of the cultural and political consensus, which I think has this is where the red flashing light goes off for me a little bit about how we sustain ourselves.
So I think you don't sustain it in the long term is the very kind of unfortunately pessimistic answer here. I mean, this is kind of right out of Lincoln's famous House Divided speech. I mean, the very first aim of the preamble of the Constitution is to strive for a, quote, more perfect union. I mean, is there anything more kind of antithetical to the notion of a more perfect union than parallel competing institutions of banks, of tech companies, of film studios, of things like that? Look, I mean, obviously kind of, Hollywood becoming leftist and playing to its own audience. And none of this is particularly new. I will say I have barely even heard of Nomadland. I saw like one or two movies over the past year. Nomadland was not one of them.
I read about it in The New Yorker, which should tell you everything about Nomadland. That's how I encountered it.
It's a beautiful film, I will say. It is a beautiful film.
No, I'll check it out. I did a quick search. It looks like Frances McDermott's in it. She's wonderful. So I actually probably will check it out. But we mentioned the Daily Wire here. I used to work there, and I remember when I was there, I talked with Ben Shapiro because Ben grew up in North Hollywood. His mom is kind of a longtime kind of Hollywood executive type. He has like personally watched like every Oscar nominated film, going back to like the 1940s or 30s or something like that. I seriously wonder if he even kept that up this year. I mean, it would not surprise me if his streak stopped this year, just given kind of the total paucity of, I didn't even know the Oscars were on, honestly, recently. But look, this notion of two competing societies is deeply toxic. And it kind of brings me to an ancillary point here. I agree with everything Rachel said. All I will add, especially because Rod Dreher's kind of Benedict option came up in discussion earlier here, I actually don't think the Benedict option is a sustainable solution. It's appealing in kind of a superficial level. If anything, it kind of seems like Rod Dreher is kind of borrowing from the American Orthodox Jewish playbook. Actually, America's Orthodox Jewish population has effectively been doing exactly that for a century. If
He's
not
rooting it in
that.
Catholicism, but yeah.
Right, yeah, but like in practice, it's kind of quite similar.
Yeah.
The issue, though, and I kind of take this back to Adrian Vermeule's book review of Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed that he wrote for American Affairs back in 2018. What Adrian basically says is that because, and Adrian is talking here because the ultimate kind of conclusion from Patrick's book, he kind of diagnoses why, in his opinion, liberalism has failed, and then his conclusion is effectively kind of a more or less endorsement of Roger's Benedict doctrine. But I think Vermeule's apt criticism of that is that the Benedict option, so to speak, still kind of necessarily relies upon the beneficence, upon the generosity of the ruler, of the ruling liberal imperium, so to speak. That's just not sustainable, especially as the left gets more and more woke and less tolerable of dissenting opinions here. So I kind of just bring this back to kind of this more perfect union. Our politics, for better or for worse, at a certain level does have to be nationalized. And, this is NatCon Squad. We talk about national conservatism. For better or for worse, we really do have to care about the national arena, because if both these things can be true at once. We can focus on kind of fighting at the local level, running for school board, critical race theory. And at the same time, we cannot turn a blind eye to controlling the levers of power at the federal level. Both these things, I think, have to work in tandem with one another.
I agree, and I'll be brief here. I've long held that all the signs point towards heading for ideological segregation as a country in our everyday lives and in most of our everyday institutions that we frequent, and it's sad to see it come to that. But if you do the thought exercise of what is it that unifies Americans of all stripes today, it's very hard to think of an answer to that. I used to think that sports was the one thing that unified us. It's one of the only venues where if you go to a game, you'll see people of every kind getting together and they can bond over what they're seeing on the field, either hatred of the opposing team or love of the home team. But that's gone now because, of course, sports themselves have gone woke and the fans can still root for teams. But I find myself as a baseball fanatic having to hold my nose and, essentially very torn as to do I root for this player or not based upon the views that they take, which are basically that they hate my guts if they knew what I thought. Or the league writ large, obviously taking a position when it comes to the Georgia laws and beyond. So it's very hard to find unifying institutions. There was a time in Hollywood, even though Hollywood was for a period dominated by leftists and in some cases even secret communists, there was still pro-Americanism, certainly from Hollywood. And there was a common understanding. Even among Democrats, there were anti-communist Democrats, and it was probably a majority of that party. If you fast forward to today, I don't see that unity. And of course, among the kind of arch left in this country, which again, as we've spoken to, are dominating all of our cultural institutions, they believe that America is fundamentally irredeemable, deplorable, evil, and from its very founding was such. So if we completely disagree on the nature of the founding and the values and principles that flowed from it, it's very hard to see how we do anything more than coexist as a country rather than being a country that truly is a melting pot in every single respect. And so, I think the task is, do any of us want to live in a country where we merely coexist? I don't think that's a direction that we want to go. It's being thrust upon us. And so the question is, ultimately, can we win the war of ideas? And that's why I think that I go back to my argument that the intellectual side of things is critical. There's a practical element of this as well. And there's a practical element to getting back to a place where we can actually compete on an even playing field in these intellectual institutions and beyond. But more broadly, we have to win the war of ideas ultimately, or we lose everything else.
With that, I will actually just toss it right on back to you, Ben.
All right, so let me talk about a really pernicious idea that came forth in this Congress, a bill sponsored by Mazie Hirono, as I described her in a recent piece in Newsweek, the due process denying discriminatory senator from Hawaii. And Mazie Hirono put out this bill, originally a very short bill that was called the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, and it retained that name through its overwhelming passage last week. And the bill was essentially stripped of its core substance, ultimately, mercifully for the American people. But I think it's worth talking about what was in the original legislation, leaving aside the fact that COVID-19 hate crime itself is a completely new, novel concept. And as I argue in this piece for Newsweek out last week, ultimately, it's not about hate crimes, it's about thought crimes, because what is a COVID-19 hate crime in the first place? So here's how it's described in the bill, and I'll quote a little bit from my piece here. The original COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act defines such a hate crime as being motivated in part by the actual or perceived relationship to the spread of COVID-19 of any person. And the bill called for the Attorney General and the Secretary of Health and Human Services to, and I quote here, in coordination with the COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force and community-based organizations, issue guidance on quote unquote best practices to mitigate racially discriminatory language in describing the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so what's the broader context for this original bill? Well, Mazie Hirono and plenty of others across both sides of Congress argue that there's a substantial rise in anti-Asian hate, and it's usually citing this group Stop AAPI Hate, which came together really in March of last year, a leftist-dominated group run by a series of progressive organizations, which has built this portal, which is somewhat nondescript because, for example, it doesn't allow you to report perpetrators of perceived anti-Asian hatred, but only the substance of the purported hatred. And they cite this report, and actually it's in the bill, language about this showing that there have been 3,800 incidents, according to this one portal, of anti-Asian hate over the last year. Well, over 90% of those incidents are verbal. A very small percentage, mercifully, are actually physical in any way, so they don't seem to be actual hate crimes. But more broadly, this group Stop AAPI Hate and like-minded individuals have sought to suggest that this is all a consequence of what else but Donald Trump's rhetoric about the coronavirus. They've sought to link criticism of the Chinese Communist Party explicitly, and if you go to Stop AAPI Hate's website, they have reportage on this about all the comments from the likes of the president, the former President Trump, and Senator Tom Cotton and others, saying it is anti-Chinese rhetoric when it comes down to calling the coronavirus by its rightful name and ascribing culpability to the Chinese Communist Party for spreading it, which, oh, by the way, seems to only be gaining in credence as the lab leak theory becomes more and more viable and there becomes more and more evidence for it. So this was sort of a twofer of a piece of legislation. It sought to chill speech, which was critical of the Chinese Communist Party in practice by calling the coronavirus by its rightful name, the Chinese coronavirus. And beyond that fact, of course, it has the broader chilling effect of chilling speech generally, because if you define a hate crime on the basis of perceived link to COVID-19, I mean, what does that even mean? It's completely in the eye of the beholder and subjective. So I think the broader impact of the original legislation was to chill speech generally and give more power to members of Congress to abridge our speech, but then also a twofer to protect the Chinese Communist Party as well, in effect. So I think it was a substantial piece of original legislation that was brought. Luckily, the bill was essentially gutted, but even in the final piece of legislation, the preamble to it cites that 3,800 hate crime number. Again, mercifully low percentage of violent crimes in this country. And oh, by the way, a substantial portion of those crimes historically have been carried out by other minority groups, not the white supremacists who the likes of Mazie Hirono ascribe these acts to. But setting aside the fact that it's a mercifully low number of such acts, the grasping at straws is really remarkable. The bill cites in that preamble the Atlanta area shootings of a couple of massage parlors by a self-described, by all accounts, disturbed, deranged individual who was a sex addict, had nothing to do with race, but it has to be cited in the bill to continue perpetuating the narrative that we are a systemically racist and bigoted white supremacist country. And then, of course, it emanates from President Trump and then, of course, by extension, his tens of millions of followers. So this was a really pernicious bill. Again, it retained the name COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act all the way through its passage. Luckily, it was gutted so that it's mainly about reporting more on hate crimes with some more detail and online portals associated with it and funding associated with it and training associated with identifying it. And I'm sure that there are pernicious elements to the substance of the final bill, but I think the significance of the original bill stands, and it is likely to shift the Overton window ultimately on free speech in this country. And the linkage, of course, of hateful speech itself being perceived as or considered violence and potentially something that will ultimately hit our laws, which will have a no doubt chilling effect on our country and, of course, completely undermine the First Amendment on which all of our other amendments rely. So with that, I'm curious to open it up, what others take away from the COVID-19 hate crimes charade of a bill.
So I think there's two elements of the Senate's consideration that really struck me, because I think you accurately described that this bill was sort of based on substanceless claims, or grossly amplified claims, and also that it was a very significant threat to free speech. That said, every single Republican senator voted for it. Right, except for Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley was the one no vote, and I will note that there were I think 3 senators absent, one of which was Mike Lee from Utah, but they all voted for it with no qualms, right? They still voted for it because, again, the thing they're all terrified of is being called a racist, because in America today, being called a racist is worse than being called a murderer, and somehow we all buy into this because we don't want to be canceled. So I think that until we actually see people stand up and be able to say, this is nonsense and why, and yes, you can cancel me and call me all kinds of names, but I'm not doing this out of some racial animus. I'm doing this because this is common sense. We aren't going to win this. And it's clear we still haven't reached that point. The second thing I thought was really interesting about this debate was that I know it was Senator Cruz, and I think it was Senator Blackburn offered an amendment pointing out that, or was an amendment basically saying no money should go to institutions that have racial quotas for Asian Americans. Obviously, this is riffing off the very famous lawsuit pointing out that Asian Americans are disproportionately discriminated against in Ivy League institutions. Like, this is empirically known and accepted. And yet when presented with actual evidence of mass discrimination against Asian Americans, every single Democrat voted against it. And they're like, no. We have an obsessive need to virtue signal. We can't actually do anything real here. And it's stunning. It's stunning. And the fact that wasn't enough to push Republican senators into acknowledging the charade, and that the Senate was wasting a week of its time on this obvious, virtue signaling moment, I was actually really disappointed by those Republicans. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you for bringing up that amendment. I just appreciate you hitting that, because of course it proves a lie of the concern over racism by this purportedly, I guess, anti-racist bill.
Yeah, and I'm really happy Rachel brought that up. Max Eden, formerly of Manhattan Institute, now at AEI, has a great piece this week out of Newsweek on this exact bill, or excuse me, on the exact proposal from Senator Cruz and Senator Kennedy with respect to defunding higher education institutions that expressly discriminate. I just have a brief word to add on just the overall, just the breathtaking cynicism of the Democratic Party and the American left with respect to Asian Americans in particular here. Lee Smith, who is always a must read on literally everything he writes about, but he's really great on China. His most recent kind of China-related essay for Tablet, I think it's called All China's Parties. Towards the end of the essay, he talks a little bit about this. He basically says, are the Democrats actually claiming that the Asians getting beaten up in like Midtown Manhattan and San Francisco and Oakland are MAGA hat clad like rural redneck yahoos? I mean, this is like right out of like Jussie Smollett, right? I mean, like it is a breathtakingly cynical gaslighting of the American people, frankly. But the other kind of point that Lee makes in his essay, I think it's kind of worth hammering this home. Ben has written about this a lot. Kind of the overarching Democratic Party ruling class pan-institutional infrastructure, if you will, from kind of the politicians themselves to the administrative state to Hollywood to Fortune 500. They are so dependent on China, both in terms of their labor market. Obviously, we are all familiar with the situation in Xinjiang and the actual genocide taking place there. The labor market and the consumer market, of course, the NBA, LeBron James. I mean, they are all just completely in the tank for China for express kind of commercial and political support reasons. And for that reason, perhaps more than anything else, it is incumbent upon the Democratic Party leadership to shift the blame, or to try to shift the blame, to Trump and the MAGA hat and and that whole crew. No, their basic claim is, don't believe your lying eyes. Just keep on sending us money to the DNC. That is basically what they're saying here. And frankly, what Rachel said, the vote on this Cruz-Kennedy amendment, it just proves the entire lie and just how little Democrats actually care about Asian Americans.
And I'll just jump in to say, I don't even think for all of them it's a lie. I think a lot of this shows the total incoherence of their language with any sort of coherent foundational principles or philosophy. I think if you look at what Mazie Hirono does in the Senate, it doesn't seem to be principled. It just seems to be the principle of virtue signaling based on feel-goodery. And I really think that's their foundation. That's their intellectual foundation at this point, because when you're voting against amendments like that and showing no prioritization or concern for an issue like that, there's just no basic coherence. Your foundation is incoherent. Your foundation, your intellectual philosophy is based on a total house of sand. You don't know what you believe in, except for believing in feel-goodery that also, by the way, you have an incentive to believe in because it helps you raise money. And so I just honestly think, for some people, they're outright lying. And for a lot of people on the left, however, because there's such incentives in our culture right now towards virtue signaling, and that's partially because of social media, and because they don't have a watchdog in the form of the news media that would help them sharpen into a coherent philosophy, it's just morphing into something totally incoherent, but based on virtue signaling, fundraising, and media coverage, positive media coverage. So it's just a complete joke, and everyone should learn from Josh Hawley on this issue, just in the same way that everyone learned from the Kristi Noem incident. These are like obvious lessons. You don't have to be cowed by the left's language anymore because there's a new media infrastructure that is standing up for reason and just sort of like basic logic. So there's something to be learned from this.
So I think we'll take it around the room for some final thoughts before we end this episode. But I'll just start by, I think, coming back to something that Josh referenced when we were talking about this idea of you will be made to care, right? We've always sort of laughed about that, but I think we are really living in this moment. And it requires, I think, our politics to have a national bent. Because as conservatives, I think as Republicans too, as an establishment party, we've always sort of operated off this idea that, we can build our own institutions, or, the left's just being crazy, let them be crazy. That's no longer an option, right? The left has dominated every institution of our society such that they are enforcing their own preferences on us in every possible way. And so I think the way in which the right has conducted itself for the last 30 years doesn't have an answer to this. It is not enough to simply say, well, just shrink the government. Well, just, ignore the left in their paroxysms and their spasms. It is not enough. And that's why I think the sort of conversations around national conservatism are important, because as I've always understood conservatism, our traditions are meant for this. Our traditions are such that, we are supposed to be preserving what is good and what is, rooted in the best parts of America. And we stand up and we push for that in moments like this. I was in a debate recently with someone who told me, well, the founders wouldn't really want us to engage like that. They would want us to fight. This is literally a quote, fight with one hand tied behind our back, because that's, what they did. And I'm sorry, I just reject that sentiment, because George Washington did not have one hand tied behind his back when he crossed the Delaware to attack the Hessians on Christmas. That is not the actions of someone who said, I'm going to just lay down and take it, for the sake of propriety in the Constitution. That is not our heritage. That is not what we as Americans and conservatives have been raised to believe. So I think we have to fully engage these arguments. We can have debates about, means and ends and what should get us there. We should have those debates. But I think this idea that you should just lay down and take it and there's nothing we can do, I just reject it. And I reject every part of it, from Republican orthodoxy and, I think entrenched conservative orthodoxy. So I'll leave that there.
My final thought is just a quick piggyback on that, which is the good news, as we always try to be sure we're keeping on the sunny side of things, is that the new media infrastructure and the new economic infrastructure is building up. And we don't have to splinter. It is possible that it becomes a sort of market challenger in so many of these spheres. And I think you're seeing that to some extent happen right now with new media challenging corporate media. It hasn't happened yet to the point where corporate media is self-correcting, and I'm not under the impression that it will happen anytime soon, if ever. But it is always true that when you build up new infrastructures and you draw more and more eyeballs away as institutional trust continues decaying, that's institutional trust in old Hollywood, that's institutional trust in academia, that's institutional trust in everything. This new media infrastructure is building up quickly. Gina Carano, when she was canceled from The Mandalorian by Disney, she landed at the Daily Wire again, which is playing a really key pivotal role in this, whether they actually go into the men's grooming business or not. They're doing this in Hollywood. They work with the legitimate film studio. They distributed a movie recently, and they're snapping up people like Gina Carano. And so that's empowering for people that are in these corroded old institutions to say, I don't care if I get canceled because I have a safe place to land that's not going to just produce, like versions of the Left Behind movies, but like serious cinema that can actually compete with, movies that are coming out of old Hollywood. And so the good news is that new media infrastructure is building up, and people can help it build up by supporting Substacks, by supporting Patreons and podcasts, and the like. So to the extent that we have something to look forward to, it's that. And maybe that'll result in us splintering, or maybe it will result in us having robust competition. So let's hope for the latter.
Well, just quickly following up on Emily's point, and in its spirit, I urge everyone to check out our show for the Federalist Bad News, which covers all the media's malfeasance on a week-to-week basis, as well as the emerging independent competition against the corporate media. But that shameless plug aside, I also want to end on something of a positive note, which is that the census numbers came out recently this week. And one of the interesting takeaways there is, first of all, and this is sort of tragic, but at the same time a positive, California showed no population growth, which I believe may have been unprecedented for the decennial census. And it shows that people are clearly voting with their feet, and that progressivism writ large really does turn people's stomachs ultimately in practice. It's tragic for the people who are living under it. And if you look at the streets of San Francisco and LA, you can see that today. But leaving that aside as well, New York lost a House seat, and it's happened in several other blue states as well. Now, the others, and this all happened, by the way, even counting illegal aliens in the census count. So it's an interesting positive. Everyone ought to be keenly attuned to the nuance and in the weeds on what happens with redistricting, particularly in the states controlled by Republicans, to see how that ultimately plays out, and whether Republicans ultimately cave and the establishment dominates in those redistricting processes. And then the other thing we have to look to is, okay, with folks leaving blue states, oftentimes for red states, what happens to the red states ultimately? And that's I think it may prove to be potentially a double-edged sword, that Republican states are a victim of their success at the end of the day. And you see New Yorkers moving to Florida and Californians moving to Texas, obviously. We'll see how the trend plays out. But nevertheless, it does show that common sense does still prevail to some extent across the country.
Yeah, look, I lived in Texas for 4 years. I own 7 pairs of cowboy boots, and for better or for worse, I kind of consider myself an honorary Texan. It's certainly where my concealed carry gun license still is in Texas. But anyway, I was happy to see Texas pick up two seats there. I think it's kind of still TBD as to actually how kind of the outflows into red states is going to shake out. If I recall, the exit polling from Ted Cruz's somewhat narrow victory over Beto in 2018 was that non-native Texans actually counterintuitively voted for Cruz at a higher percentage than native Texans. So I think the jury's kind of still out for that. Maybe some people genuinely are voting with their feet. I don't have a whole lot to add. Rachel's closing remarks was just straight fire. I would just heartily endorse that. Since she kind of referenced You Only Made to Care, this kind of viral Eric Erickson blog post from 2013, Eric wrote that, if I recall, he's the editor-in-state of Red State at the time. I think it was in the context, if I'm not mistaken, of the gay marriage debate. I think it was the Windsor case, which is kind of the first of the 2 landmark gay marriage cases at the Supreme Court. That was 8 years ago. At this point, you will not be made to care. At this point, you will care, or you are a moron. At this point, you must care. You must care for your own preservation of the nation state, for your own preservation of your community, your own preservation of your ability to worship and practice your religion, the own preservation of your family here. I think back just real quick, maybe the most at least one of the most famous dissents the late Justice Scalia ever had was in a 1988 case called Morrison versus Olson, which took on the somewhat arcane it was somewhat arcane subject matter of the constitutionality of the independent prosecutor, which deeply offended Justice Scalia's sensibilities pertaining to the unitary executive. And in his courageous solo dissent, Justice Scalia describes this. He says, quote, "This wolf comes as a wolf." And I really think the threat facing us is a wolf that is very clearly in our face, 5-alarm siren flashing as a wolf. So we will care, or we are going to risk losing everything.
Well, on behalf of all of the people who don't want to be eaten by wolves, on behalf of Josh, Ben, and Emily, I'm Rachel Bovard. We'll see you on the next NatCon Squad.